that they were getting along just fine. It was very, very early on. They had just met each other about 3 weeks ago. So the relationship hadn't run its course or gotten very far into it at all. But no, there was no fighting or arguing or anything like that. They were both, professional people.
A woman claims she was under a marijuana-induced psychotic episode when she stabbed her boyfriend to death, striking him over 100 times. We break down the legal case with psychologist Dr. John Delatorre. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Now, if I were to tell you that a woman is accused of stabbing her boyfriend 108 times, you would think that's murder, right? Of course. That is not the case of 32-year-old Bryn Spejcher out in California. Let me break this down for you. So Spejcher was in a relationship with 26-year-old Chad O'Melia. They'd only been dating for about a month. And that is when on May 28th, 2018, the two allegedly smoked weed together in Chad's condo. And Spejcher then took several knives, threw them at Chad, ended up stabbing him in the throat, the chest, the knee, the head, the heart. Now, she allegedly told police that she committed this killing because she had a cannabis-induced psychotic vision with voices, fearing that she was dead and that she needed to kill Chad to survive. She also ended up stabbing her own dog, turned the knives on herself, cutting her face and neck. When one of Chad's roommates called 911 and officers arrived, Spejcher was cutting herself, and they ended up shocking her with a stun gun and using a baton to subdue her. So she was first charged with second-degree murder, but prosecutors asked for the lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter. This came after a forensic psychologist submitted a report that found Spejcher was acutely psychotic during this violent episode. Now, the judge overseeing the case eventually granted the state's requested reduction, and now she is on trial for involuntary manslaughter. I want to bring in psychologist Dr. John Delatorre to talk a little bit more about this. Doctor, good to have you on. First, would you agree, and obviously you haven't had a chance to look at all of the materials in this case, but would you agree with the forensic psychologist here? Because Dr. Chris Mahandi said it looked like Spejcher was possessed in the body cam footage from the officers, and also said that the stabbing of her own beloved dog, quote, without any evidence of animal cruelty tendencies, is highly inconsistent with her love of dogs and underscores her level of impairment. What do you think?
Yeah, I somewhat agree, right? And here's my concern about some of this stuff is that it can look like we're trying to say that this person was insane. She was not insane, right? And here's the issue. You can't be insane if you're taking an intoxicant, right? So she wasn't having these psychotic symptoms just as a direct result of having schizophrenia. She was having these psychotic symptoms and these violent outbursts, right? The spontaneous violence as a direct result of ingesting marijuana and intoxicant. And so while she may have been in an acute psychotic state, I don't know generally, right? I don't know that necessarily leads to insanity, number one, or should have even led to a reduction in culpability. Now, the law says all different kinds of stuff about criminal intent, but this is one of those curious times when drugs and psychology and law all kind of come together and coalesce in this fascinating and disturbing case.
So a couple of things to break down there. Yeah, you're right. When we talk about murder, we talk about intent to kill, and maybe they're saying there wasn't an intent to kill, or it's going to be difficult for them to prove intent to kill. Involuntary manslaughter, we're talking more about a recklessness standard. Now, I do want to go into a little bit about what you said, because the prosecution, they're still prosecuting this case. They still are trying to find her guilty of involuntary manslaughter. A senior deputy DA reportedly said during opening statements, quote, "The law says when someone voluntarily ingests an intoxicant and bad things happen, like a DUI, the person responsible is the person who voluntarily ingests the intoxicant and does the bad thing. We don't get to blame other people when we do something bad because we want it to get high." Now, the defense has taken a different position. They are basically saying that Spejcher had no way of knowing this would happen, and she had no history of mental illness. They also seem to say that she was pressured to smoke by Chad. But I guess the argument could be that, if she did something where, let's say someone takes Tylenol, or say someone takes a drink of alcohol and it's spiked with something that you wouldn't have expected and creates a reaction you would not have expected, how could she be to blame for what happened here? Those are the two arguments. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that are there. Number one, I think there's an element of duress. So let's say that there was some way that we could prove that Chad had forced Bryn to smoke their marijuana, that she didn't want to do it, but he forced her to do it. So I think in some ways we could have a diminished capacity argument to be made because she did it under duress. But here's the other aspect of it, is that even if she had taken marijuana from before, it doesn't mean that that automatically means that she knows how her body is going to respond to marijuana any subsequent time. There is no regulation on marijuana, not in any real sense. And so it's certainly possible that, although not in this case, it's certainly possible that the marijuana that she was smoking was more potent or perhaps laced, right? That there's some other element associated with it that when she ingested it impacted her brain chemistry to the point that she had such a severe reaction.
Okay, now let's jump on that for a minute, because you know that the family, and I'll get into the family's response in a minute, we're not happy with this decision to downgrade it from murder to involuntary manslaughter. They believe this was a conscious killing. The question I think all the jurors are going to have, the question that we all have is, did she really have these visions? And was she really in a induced psychosis? Have you ever seen a case like this where someone smokes weed and they have a violent outburst like this and they have these kind of psychotic visions?
Yes, I have. But it's usually because the vision that they are experiencing, right? The visual hallucination that they're experiencing is so distressing that they believe that their life is in danger. Right, that they legitimately believe that whatever it is that they're seeing is threatening their own, safety in some kind of way. And so even individuals who have no prior history of violence can absolutely engage in violence because they are now disinhibited by the substances and they're in distress because of the hallucinations that they are experiencing.
Well, talk us through what the THC, the high potency THC, the chemical in cannabis, what does that do to your brain?
Right. So THC is the psychoactive compound. So it's the one that crosses the blood-brain barrier the easiest. It's also the one that's commonly associated with the euphoric experiences that you're having. But that being said, the problem is that all of our brain chemistries, all the different neurotransmitters and all the different hormones that are flooding our brains in any given moment are all impacted by the intoxicants that we introduce. And so we can never truly know how that intoxicant, how THC, even though it's never really known to produce this kind of spontaneous violence, has been shown to produce different kinds of mind-altering experiences like auditory and visual hallucinations.
Does it matter how many times you are if you're a regular, if you regularly smoke weed, does that affect it? Whether if it were somebody you're doing it for the first time? My understanding, based on the reports, is she had smoked weed in the past several times. I mean, again, to be honest with you, I haven't heard of a case quite like this. After this one, I read about it. I have seen criminal cases like this before where weed is the question about if it caused a psychotic episode. But does it matter how often that person smoked weed?
The science says yes, right? So most people believe that marijuana and THC are relatively safe, and that is wholly incorrect. It's certainly possible that the more THC that you consume over the course of your lifetime, the more likely you are to experience these kinds of hallucinations, auditory, visual, more regularly than someone who only smokes, intermittently.
But here's the thing. The idea that this would spark a vision that you're dead and you have to kill Chad in order to survive, that feels so violent, so demonic, so evil, so specific. Sometimes don't you have visions of, it's kind of euphoric and happy and calm? But explain that to me, because I for me, listening to this, I would have thought smoking marijuana like this would have produced a different kind of vision, a different kind of result.
Yeah. Just taken on its face, marijuana is a depressant, right? It depresses the nervous system so that you can be essentially more calm or at least more disinhibited. That's why people take CBD and other kinds of stuff for anxiety and all different kinds of other stuff where their body is too up, it's too elevated. But here's the thing: once you start taking an intoxicant, it starts impacting the brain's ability to interpret the information it's getting from its body. That's how we know how things are happening in the world around us, through our five senses. And if the brain's not interpreting any of that information in a appropriate way, it can start responding to those situations in an inappropriate way. So it's possible that she started smoking marijuana. Maybe her heart rate slows down from what it was from before. So her brain thinks that something is going on and it needs to respond in kind. So maybe it wasn't that she was having a legitimate, that we'll say legitimate, like someone with schizophrenia, that she's having a legitimate auditory or visual hallucination, but her body is going through something and her brain's trying to interpret it. And that's the best way that it knows how to interpret whatever it is that's going on.
Doctor, this is almost a legal question, but do you think it was a mistake to not keep the murder charge and have as an option involuntary manslaughter? Because that's what they could have said, right? They could have gone to the jury and said, we believe that this is murder. You may not see it that way. You have the option to find her guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a lesser reduced charge. But it seemed the prosecutors, they were persuaded by the forensic psychologist opinion that there was no intent to kill. But obviously, like you said, it was her choice to ingest this drug. And that is where the criminal responsibility comes from. But do you disagree? Because let me just tell you what the family said, okay? And they've been quite outspoken. So the family said that this decision to downgrade it was an ambush on part of the prosecutors. And Chad O'Melia's father, Sean, he spoke out and said, quote, "You're supposed to fight for the victim and his family. And I'm sitting there listening to them. And it was a group of people that were out acting purely from either fear of something. Maybe it's politics, publicity. I don't know." Goes on to say that Chad had cried out to his roommate and said, "I need you to call the police. I've been stabbed. Get out of the condominium." So, he's getting stabbed and he's worried about his roommate to get out of there. It's really, really sad. And I completely understand the family's perspective. But do you think it was a mistake for the prosecutors to not at least give the option for the jury to find this to be murder?
Yeah, and I totally understand. I know Chris Mohandy, I know his work, and I can certainly see when you're interacting with him that you think, oh my God, like he's going to be easily able to switch a jury, and to go to the defense side.
But that's the forensic psychologist, just to be clear.
That's the forensic psychologist, Dr. Chris Mohandy.
Right.
But as a prosecutor, if I'm a prosecutor on this case, what I have to remind myself is that I have the actus reus and I have the mens rea. Nowhere in there is motivation. Right? Did she do this thing and did she have the intent? And one could make the argument, even in his report, where she's engaging in this violent act, right? Purposefully. She thinks that she's, going to die or something like that, but she's still attacking someone else purposefully. So if I'm the prosecutor, I don't know that I just necessarily give in and just automatically go for the lesser included. I think I try to at least get the murder. And if I can't, then I know that I have at least this other thing that I can do.
Now I'll play devil's advocate here because a jury could look at that and say, wow, you really overcharged her. And that could be a problem for the prosecution's case and maybe would backfire. It seems to me, and I think this was indicated during the opening statements, that she's going to take the stand. I don't understand what she's going to say. Because what would be her ability to recall what she was thinking or feeling while under this psychotic episode? Do you recall how you were feeling? Have you ever seen that?
Yeah. So again, and we're not saying that she was insane. That's not what
Correct.
Dr. Mohandy said. That's not what I'm saying. But when you look at someone's sanity, when you're trying to evaluate that, it is retrospective. We are talking to someone who's potentially, sane now, but we're thinking that they were insane at the time. So is it possible for them to start recalling what were the experiences like, maybe not at the time when they were doing the stabbing, but just before and just after, where they start hearing the voices and they start experiencing these kinds of things? It's certainly possible for that to exist. The problem with a case like this is that it was done because of an intoxicant. And because of that, it's probably not likely that she has full recall of any of those things that are going on that would exist even with someone with schizophrenia.
In your experience, people who are facing these kinds of charges, claiming that a drug or a substance caused these psychotic episodes, are they usually found guilty, or does a jury say, it wasn't their fault?
I think it depends on sort of what stage that we're at. But what I've seen is that if a drug is involved or alcohol is involved, the jury is not likely to accept whatever excuse that they hear from the defense.
Now, I should tell you that with the involuntary manslaughter charge, she still could face prison time. I mean, if convicted, she could face 4 years in prison, maybe even longer, since there's a special circumstances attached to the charge that it was being, an extremely violent crime where a weapon was used. So there is still a lot on the line, but obviously the family was looking for the murder charge where she could have spent over 20 years in prison. Dr. John, thank you so much. Appreciate your insight. Difficult case, but I'm glad you were able to clarify a little bit about what this means and what it doesn't. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.